Hello everyone. Since I am just a tiny bit late discussing this patch, so I'm going to change up the way I talk about these characters a little bit, in the sense that I'm not going to sit around here and just recap the basic mechanics of these guys, because I think by now most of you have probably played the trial stages and understand more or less how they work. So I'll focus a little bit more on some of the minor details of these characters. So first we have this Ironblood Commander here. So most of you are probably aware that the main core mechanic that she brings to the table is her talent, which is basically a choice between an offensive or a defensive buff. Now the talent itself actually outlines this fact, but for the offensive buff, and I guess some people were kind of surprised by this, but it does indeed only target herself and 2 allies. You can't target 3 other allies, it has to include herself. And the targeting priority for this thing is it targets the 2 units to the right of the Ironblood Commander first, and then to her left, and then it's either up or down. There's no priority between up and down, at least not that we can see, because if there was a choice between up and down, that means the slots are filled in a way so that it can prioritize the right side first. Now, I don't know if this was intentional, but by making this offensive buff target in this way, where she prioritizes targeting the units to the right of her rather than to the left of her, it is just a slight bit better for player 2 than it is for player 1 in Apex. I think this is pretty interesting because, personally, I think right now player 1 is favored quite a bit more in Apex. Some would say this has always been the case, but I think it has been more and more the case for a while now because the meta has become more and more aggressive over time. Tanks aren't as useful anymore. So it is kind of nice to get this one thing from the Ironblood Commander, which maybe helps out player 2 a little bit. The defensive buff is also very nice. If you are someone who still likes playing tank push, both her offensive and defense buff is unique compared to other stat buffs because they are soldier buffs, which can help a lot. For those of you who have kind of looked into the damage mechanics of the game before will know that soldier stats and soldier damage, it's one of those things where you have to cross certain thresholds for it to matter a lot more. You'll often hear people talk about how I need to get my soldiers to a point where I can 1-tick or 2-tick the enemy soldiers, because anything in between that doesn't actually matter that much, at least for the purposes of if I want to one-shot the enemy unit, which is what you do most of the time in Arena nowadays. There's obviously a lot more variables that go into this, but that is one of the big reasons why Ironblood Commander is so useful. She's not just a good team enabler between being able to mass attack and buff the movement of some of your lower base movement units. She is also able to simultaneously buff soldier stats, which is not something you see a lot of. The standard Florentia can do that too, although people don't bring that skill very often in Apex. But yeah, getting an extra 25% attack on your soldiers, or an extra 15% defense on your soldiers, the 25% attack especially, that can be the difference between one-shotting a tank and not one-shotting them, or your tank surviving a tank bust and then not surviving one. I want to say the defensive one is a little bit less useful in that context, if only because so many of the tank bust attacks these days, including the one from Ironblood Commander herself, dispels a bunch of buffs, and that would probably include this defense buff as well. Although of course you can do the thing where you have like 15 buffs and then hope your opponent doesn't dispel the right ones. So yeah, that's the most unique aspect of Ironblood Commander, and really the main reason you would be pulling for her. Because of her access to mass attack, I think she's good in basically any box. She even has some pretty interesting defensive skills if you decide to play her in a tank push, like her defense support L. I actually think you could use that occasionally, and of course her act against skill actually has an aura in it. The other thing I see people discussing is what you should class her as. Me personally, I just see no reason whatsoever to be classing her as infantry. Her infantry class has a little bit more HP and a little bit more defense, but this isn't even like a lot of typical cases of infantry versus like a holy class or whatever, where you get a lot of advantages from being infantry. The biggest one, of course, would be Apex boots, which does not apply in this case because I really would not wear Apex boots on this character. Obviously, you'd be better off wearing like speed boots or something if you really wanted the movement. Holy gets access to cloth armor, which in this case is a lot better because not only do you have access to things like Tenyos headdress and Glory of the World, but most importantly, you get the Nebulous robe, which of course is actually compounded by the fact that the infantry class, one of the only reasons you would be using the infantry class, it would be to kill Lancer tanks like Hilda. But if Hilda was bringing Crystal Molders and you are on infantry, it's pretty likely that Ironblood Commander would just kill herself. I think there's some rare instances where being an infantry can be very helpful, and of course being holy always carries that very annoying Judge Talisman weakness, but overall I feel like you get way more downsides than upsides to being infantry, so I would class her as holy. And the last thing I guess I would say is, I guess for weapon, I would probably go with Gift of Eternal Life just because it's such a versatile weapon. But yeah, Ironblood Commander, very good unit. If you haven't pulled yet, you still have the entire month to decide. And her bonds really aren't that bad if you have been building a Tensei team. Hilda and Florentia are both pretty stable units to have for anybody playing Tensei and just anybody playing PvP in general, I think. And she will be used for bonds for both Carolean and Rostam when they come along. So that is also a consideration you should be making. So our other hero here is Archon of the Moon. So just like we mentioned last time he came up, he is a very good unit, but he isn't as broadly useful as the Ironblood Commander. As mentioned, this character is very displacement-centric, and because of that, you have to ban Hilda in order to have a safer time activating these displacements. And as we saw with Ironblood Commander, they have also added other ways to deal with displacement. Ironblood Commander has a displacement immunity built into one of the talent buffs she can give. There is the electric headwear helm that mages can equip. There's also a couple other ones that exist but aren't as good, but they're still worth remembering, like Landius can prevent displacement on himself. Serena can prevent displacement on herself, even though you don't see Serena that much. But the main point being made here is that his central mechanic has more direct counters to it than something like Ironblood Commander, who's just very straightforward. I do a bunch of damage, or I give stat buffs. And aquatic units in general have had a bit of a hard time in this game. Part of it is because there actually isn't that many aquatic units to begin with, but the over-reliance on the water tiles can be a really big problem. So far in Apex, there's still only really like 1 or 2 maps that have a lot of water on them. The big one, of course, being the lake map, or I guess the swamp map, since that's technically swamp tiles, even though it doesn't look like a swamp. But especially right now, there's a lot of units that can dispel buffs, even in AoE attacks. So when you have units like Archon of the Moon who are completely reliant on being water, that can be a bit of a problem. Aquatic units are kind of well known for being really good bruisers. They have a lot of defense as well as good offenses if they are focused into that. But a lot of that goes away if you don't have your water buff. And of course they kept trying to come up with all kinds of ways to make aquatic units have an easier time getting the water buff. Elucia, of course, just gives herself water automatically with her weapon. Alfred's accessory actually makes it so that he has water almost all the time. Of course, despite all that, Juggler is still the only aquatic unit that gets used with any regularity, and he still has the same problem he's always had where, when he loses his water buff, he kind of becomes really bad. Now, that's not necessarily as big of an issue for Archon of the Moon because not only does he have Tidal Surge, so he can safely decide when he gets his water, but he also gets water automatically from his talent when he does a displacement effect. So at least you don't ever have to worry about not getting your water unless you're buff blocked. And he's not designed to be played in a way where you want to keep his tankiness, even though he can be tanky because of pretty decent defenses. But yeah, overall, even though the Archon is pretty good, a lot of DPS slots are so competitive now, you really have to ask yourself, okay, why am I using him over another DPS? And in this case, it might be because, he might fit the factions you're using already pretty well, or you just like the way he plays. But yeah, I think the fundamental issue with aquatic units is that they obviously have to be centered around using water. I feel like Zalone doesn't give them quite enough to justify that weakness in their kit. Well, except for Juggler, obviously, because Juggler, even though he's fallen off a bit, he's still really good. And Archon of the Moon is quite good too. But of course the question is does he necessarily do anything unique compared to, say, an assassin? Because a lot of times when you're going to play him, he is going to be functioning similar to an assassin, where he pulls a weak unit away, instead of just directly piercing guard like an assassin would. Also, Archon of the Moon's bonds are a little bit more annoying. Although I do know a lot of people have Brenda anyway, just because they needed to bond Helena, so that's why they needed to get Brenda. And Warner is also a popular character in the meta right now, so it's not as bad as it might seem if you're into PvP. But yeah, overall, Archon of the Moon, like I said, pretty good. But I think for a lot of people who use him, it really comes down to whether or not they enjoy his playstyle, because there's nothing really that unique about him when you really strip it down. So one last thing I want to mention here before I move on is the skill Aqua Blast, because I've had a few people ask me before, Fjarlar, why is the description for Aqua Blast incorrect on the site, and why has it been wrong for so long? And my answer to that is that it is actually not wrong. That is actually how the skill works. So this is one of those weird cases where the in-game description, even in the Chinese version, is incorrect. The skill claims to deal 1.5 times damage normally, and then do 2 times damage if you're in water. And as I just mentioned, this is actually inaccurate. And I actually went to test this real quick using Lester, because I didn't pull for Archon of the Moon. But anyway, if you know how damage reduction and damage increases work in this game, you'll know that if you test damage dealt or attack boost or damage multipliers from skills, it will end up with a different damage result. So in this case, Aqua Blast does deal extra damage in water instead of actually increasing the skill multiplier. And based on my testing, and I might have done my math wrong, somebody can go double check if they want to, I believe this 35% damage is just straight up damage dealt. It is not skill damage dealt. So it's actually additive to things like damage dealt from talents or damage reduction from stuff like Royal Cavalry. So anyway, this has actually been how the skill worked since day one. I think a lot of people don't realize this just because, like I said, nobody uses that many aquatic units, and the aquatic units that do get used don't actually have Aqua Blast. Well, Varash had Aqua Blast, but not that many people were using Varash. Also, I'm pretty sure most people will not be using Aqua Blast on Archon of the Moon either, because 90% of the time you're probably bringing Tidal Surge. So yeah, there's your fun fact for the video. Aqua Blast actually technically is slightly better than 2 times damage, even if the opponent has no damage reduction whatsoever. So exclusives, let's keep this short. Moo is really bad, and Suzette's is good, but is something she should have had to begin with. I mean, I really don't understand what they were going for with Mew's exclusive here. In my opinion, it doesn't even make sense with the support functions that she can give. Creating force around yourself is not that useful, which is why nobody brought that skill to begin with. And you don't even get to decide when to activate it, and it has a long cooldown. It's just like, it's everything that could be bad in an exclusive for her. Suzette's weapon, on the other hand, is really good. Like I said, a lot of these are things she really should have had built into her kit in the first place. The fact that she should have been Glory faction to begin with. She should have been able to target the ground to begin with. And the extra crit rate is nice. It does kind of suck that this is the weapon slot, because, you know, it means you don't have Extreme Magic Bow anymore, or you don't have Crystal Dagger, if you really like using Crystal Dagger on her. It's not that good on her, but she was crit-centric, and she did have Riposte as a fallback, so Crystal Dagger wasn't terrible on her. As for a lot of the other things that were quote-unquote supposed to come on this patch, a lot of them were included in the last patch, so that's probably why this patch is going to seem a lot smaller than a typical one. So we are getting the Fair Arena / Challengers Arena again. I'll see if I have time to just record myself playing around with some silly teams on it. But honestly, I feel like the units they put in there this time are pretty heavily weighted for you to play a certain way. I think the Mythical team is by far the strongest team setup you can use. They also have like a Princess team in there. The only tank they provided was Emilia, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, but I also think they didn't really provide enough healers here to play a slower game. Of course, I'll try to upload some videos for the Forbidden Battleground as well. I think the only other important thing to bring up that is coming this patch cycle is the custom equipment banner, and we should be getting that about a week from when I upload this video. So in case you need a recap of that one, it is basically you get to choose one of each equipment slot to put as the rate up for that banner. You can't just choose one equipment piece, so you have to choose a weapon, you have to choose an armor, a helm, and an accessory. So even though it's not as bad as a lot of other equipment banners, because most equipment banners have this annoying thing where there's at least one item that's a dud pull, but having 4 rate up items means that there's a pretty low chance of you getting the one that you want if you are only actually looking for one of those things. So I think it might be worth it if you actually have 4 pieces in mind that you really want. Right now I think a lot of people want more Night Blooms. For body armor, it probably is going to be like Last Rite still. The helm will probably be Fury of Tyr and Tenios Headdress as usual, and the accessory is probably going to be like Twilight Star or Swordsmith Medal. Unfortunately, you can't get the newest pieces that we just got last month. So you can't get the Tiamat armor, you can't get the physical Holy Ring, and you can't get the new hammer. So unless you're just starving really, really hard for certain pieces like Last Rites or Sorcerer Battle, I wouldn't recommend pulling on equipment banners, unless you're Will, as always. So yeah, pretty short video this time. I am working on some other videos. I know I say that a lot. I actually injured myself slightly in the last month. Getting back into it, but I actually am working on some other videos, and hopefully that'll be coming in the next few days. So just figured I'd talk about this patch real quick. See you soon. Thanks for watching, guys.